Hello, House Psych students. Today, this is part one of our social support lecture. And let me go to the first page. Social support, we're going to talk about human social support. We're going to talk about pet and animal social support. And I want you all first to reflect a little bit. This is for a clicker question. We're not using iClickers, obviously, if we're doing this online and we're doing this asynchronous. But I would like you to think about a time in your life where you experienced just pure joy. And I want you to think about, was that joy in relation to somebody else? Or was it the kind of thing where something great happened to you and you couldn't wait to tell somebody else? Was there times where there was joy? This is my little boo. She's sticking her tongue out at you. If it involved an animal or if it involves something inanimate. And that's just kind of an exercise of helping us realize just how important being around other mammals, whether it be humans or whether it be animals, how important that is to our well-being. So I want to talk about capitalization would be capitalizing on our social support. So to give you just an example, during this pandemic, I hear about people Zooming with family and friends. I hear about people FaceTiming. I hear about WhatsApp, that type of thing, where a lot of us are having to reach out and find, if we've been quarantined and we've been in isolation, reaching out to other people in different ways. And so capitalization would be when we're seeking out other people in response to something positive. Okay, so here's a textbook definition for social support. The feeling that a person feels loved or valued, part of a network, a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, which is the opposite of thinking about people who are really isolated. I'm not talking about like stay at home, shelter in place, pandemic kind of isolation. I'm talking about people who are really cut off from relationships with others, or even worse for our health, are people who feel rejected by others. They're isolated because they've been rejected, would be the opposite of the way that we're conceptualizing this construct of social support. One of the first ways that social support was measured was by the number of social contacts. So it'd be like, how many people have you been in contact and interacted with in a day? But if we step back and we critique that, that really doesn't get to the quality of social contacts. When I used to teach in the auditorium, I would have contact with, close to 200 students at a time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that had more of a quality impact for me than if I taught a class that had, say, 20 students in the classroom. So it's really quality and not necessarily the number of contacts. There are different types of social support, so let's break these down. Companionship support would be when we get together with shared activities with other people. So people who golf, who get together and golf with other folks. In my situation, I've got some friends that I bike with, I cycle with, that I socialize with at other times, but I've got some cycling friends where the only time I ever see them is when we meet up and we cycle together. Tangible support would be providing people with material help. So as an example, the local school systems, we've got a lot of kids, because they're not in public school right now, are not getting their breakfast and their lunch in the school system. So the school systems are, what they're doing is they still have the cafeteria people making food, and they either have parents stopping by and picking up the food, or they've got school buses running where they're taking food out to people. That would be more tangible support. Anytime we donate to a charity, like we give to Red Cross or we give to Oasis, that would be an example of tangible support. The information piece, one of the things that I want to highlight here is that a lot of times, particularly for people who have a chronic illness, or particularly if they have a rare chronic illness, oftentimes they're seeing specialist doctors, and those doctors are certainly knowledgeable about how to treat those illnesses or those rare illnesses. But a lot of times those patients, actually, if they reach out on one of these different websites and they find other people who have the same chronic illness, particularly the rare chronic illness, that a lot of times just having people in the same boat provides people with more support and better information than, say, a doctor would. Or what happens for a lot of patients, like let's say you've got somebody who has irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, and they have a lot of issues with diarrhea. They certainly would be talking to their doctor about, hey, I need help with this. But they might be reaching out to other patients of like, what do you do when you're traveling and you have to be in an airport and you have to be in an airplane? How do you manage that health issue? So reaching out to others. So I just want you to know, I don't expect you to memorize these, but I just want you to know that they're out there and how valuable they can be for people with particular illnesses. The last one, emotional esteem support, is what we're going to be talking a lot more about in healthcare connections, is being an active listener, really taking in what people are saying, paying attention to their nonverbal behavior, paying attention to what they say, and really be able to empathize with it and see things in that person's shoes. So that would be that type of support. The health benefits of social support, they're very strong. This is a wide area of research, and we know that social connection, people who feel connected versus people who are not connected, have 50% reduced risk of early death. So that's how powerful social connection is to our health. We know that it helps people cope with stress, and it provides a sense of love, security, intimacy, companionship, and even touch. In relationships, we know that our quality of life, so if we were to take a scale, and there's scales out there that measure quality of life, and I'm a big fan of using quality of life as an outcome in research. The majority of our sense of quality of life is determined by our report of how much emotional intimacy that we have with other individuals. So emotional intimacy is the key aspect of our sense of quality of life. So this is how, we're social beings. This is how important it is for humans to have that intimate contact with others. And when I talk about intimacy, I'm talking more, of course there is sexual intimacy, but I'm really kind of referring to more emotional intimacy. Do you have somebody that you can go and talk to when you're feeling bad? Do you have somebody that you can go when something really good, that joy thing happens, that you can go to and share the great news, that type of thing? We know that quality of life increases our sense of happiness. Resiliency is this construct of when something bad happens to us, can we overcome that bad, and can we bounce back? So are we resilient? So sometimes bad things in life, for some people, take them out, take them down. And for other individuals, having something bad in life and having coped with it and recovered with it makes them stronger. That would be a sense of resiliency. And then cognitive capacity is our brain being free to think and problem solve, having working memory, that type of thing, that when we're connected to other people, our brain just works more efficiently. When we are distressed and we feel cut off, and especially, again, rejected, then that takes up a lot of energy and just our ability to think clearly and problem solve. So we also know psychopathology would be abnormal psychology, that people who have psychological disorders tend to have lower quality of life, and then they also tend to have less intimacy. So it's no wonder that in modern day psychotherapy, so like interpersonal therapy, IPT, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapies, all of those therapies oftentimes will have a component where we try to help people resolve conflict in relationships, find more emotional intimacy with others, really try to enhance those relationships. And that could be formal, like in couples therapy or family therapy, or it could be kind of informal, where just working with that individual, inquiring about their relationships, helping them think through how to be better, a better person in a relationship, so that they're able to kind of build those relationships, hold on to them, nurture them, that kind of thing. And we are interdependent creatures. We are wired for empathy, and we're wired to have relationships. And an example is, we know that women, I'm not stereotyping, I'm not trying to be sexist here, women tend to have more empathy, and they can put themselves in other people's shoes and know what other people are feeling, more so than boys and men. And we think the evolutionary adaptation of that is women do most of, well, childbirth, they do the childbirth, the guys don't do the childbirth. But a lot of taking care of infants, more women tend to do that than, say, dads do that. And for a good year or two, babies can't like say words to tell you what they need, and so they cry and they send off nonverbals. It would make sense that women have this empathy, because it's this ability to know, what does this baby need? Is that cry a I'm hungry cry? Is that cry I'm bored? Is that cry I'm so tired I just need to be rocked to sleep type of thing? And it makes sense that women would have more of that. The Angelo effect, which we are not seeing on that slide, the Angelo effect is missing, is when people who are coupled for long periods of time start to look more like one another. And part of the reason for that is that when people have been together for a long period of time, they take on each other's expressions. And as they take on each other's expressions, and their faces age, they actually wrinkle similarly, according to the expressions that they've made over time. Also in relationships, we know that in psychotherapy, 1/3 of the outcome, so 1/3 of, was that psychotherapy successful for that person, or 1/3 of it, didn't make any difference, or it was actually harmful, which is rare. But 1/3 of that is this thing called Therapeutic Alliance. And the Therapeutic Alliance is how close the therapist and client feel in their emotional and their intimacy and their productivity together. 1/3 of that is that relationship. It's not necessarily the techniques that the therapist is using. It's not necessarily the training that the therapist has had. It is how skilled is that therapist at getting in with that person and building that sense of, hey, I'm in this with you. I understand you. I want to help you. Let's work together. And what happens for a lot of clients in psychotherapy, if there's been a really healthy relationship that has been modeled in that professional relationship, for a lot of clients, they take those skills, those newfound skills and ways of being, and it generalizes to the other relationships in their lives. The bowling alone effect, we have talked about a bit already. This is that sense of social isolation that is happening more and more in our culture. Is certainly happening during this pandemic, which has just been bizarre. But I also want to talk about just generational trends that have been happening. A lot of college students, as an example, getting a college degree is actually a good predictor that son or daughter, that college student, after they get their degree, is a lot less likely to move back home, wherever home is, and be around extended family. Because what ends up happening for a lot of college students, is that happened to both of my sons, they have gone where the work is. And that happens to a lot of people after they graduate. You go find the job, as opposed to necessarily trying to go back home, whatever home might be. And so we know that people are spending less time with their family and friends. That this is, again, this has changed in different ways during shelter in place during the pandemic. Some of us are spending a lot of time with our animals and our partners and our family members, and some of us are spending a lot less time with family and friends. Social isolation, if we don't have a confidant, that type of thing. And people are spending less time involved in civic groups. Like my parents and my grandparents were always very, very active in community charities and organizations. And we're seeing that people are doing less of that nowadays. Okay, so how does social support affect our stress? We know that sympathetic, that fight or flight or flee, that stress response is lessened when we have social support there. This is part of the reason why nowadays is very different in hospital systems, and this is pre-COVID. But when I was a little girl, when I had a family member who was hospitalized, so like a grandparent, aunt, and uncle, that type of thing, there would be visiting hours in the hospital. Visiting hours were usually early in the evening, so that family and friends could not stop by at any time. They had to come during visiting hours. And then I remember going to the hospital and sitting in the waiting room because a lot of times they wouldn't allow kids back into the hospital room. And the hospital systems over time, again, this is pre-COVID, learned that if you had a partner with you or family members, that the more that family could stay with you or friends could stay with you, the faster you healed. Same thing for women in childbirth, as an example. Women in childbirth, it used to be back in the 1960s, they had to give birth by themselves, their nurse, and their OBGYN. And again, data over time realized that women do much better when they have a partner with them, or if they have relevant family members with them when they are in labor and delivery. We know that it is helpful even if we think about our social support, even if that person can't be with us. So we think about, like, what would my mom say to me in, while I'm going through this bad situation? What would my partner say to me? What would my best friend say with me? And this even extends up into people who have a relationship with a higher power. So people who have a relationship with God, people who have a relationship with Allah, just evoking that during times of stress can be very, very helpful for people who have those religious beliefs. We know that there's a better effect from a friend than from a stranger. That makes some sense. But isn't it interesting though, like it's kind of like the airplane effect. If people are in an airplane and they're going through turbulence, or it's a scary situation and they're surrounded by strangers, a lot of time people make friends that way. They come together. But better effect from a friend. And I'm not trying to be sexist here, this is actually based on scientific literature, that both males and females in our culture tend to benefit more from female social support. Okay, it's really interesting. Now I'm renting office space with colleagues, so I don't have my own private practice office, but I used to have a private practice where I had 2 women who had master's degrees working in the practice, and I had 1 man with a PhD, so higher level of education for the man. And when I would get a call for somebody looking for a psychotherapist, and if I gave out all 3 of their names, they always called the women. And I found that fascinating. Whether they were a man or a woman, they always called the women, even though they had less training and less education. If we wanted to get my dude any new clients, people would call in and I would give them his name, his contact information, and they would go see him, and he's a wonderful therapist. But I just found it interesting that gender bias when people were looking for a psychotherapist. Now, here's some interesting research. So females undergoing a stressful event in front of a male partner, so assuming they're heterosexual, compared to being alone, sometimes experience more stress. And if I had my class in front of me, I'd go, hey, what's this about? What do you all think about this? But a lot of you would probably say things like, the stereotype is that, like, if I share my feelings with my male partner, he usually tells me, he wants me to problem solve. He's like, well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to keep going to? And a lot of times females are thinking, like, I just need to vent and I need to feel like you understand me and that it's okay that I'm feeling this distress. And usually women get around to the problem solving at some point in time, but they don't want to be told, well, here's what you need to do. I'm going to give you advice when they're just venting their feelings. And they especially don't want to be told that you've been doing this wrong. Okay, so that's where some of that comes in. So let me play this clip on that classic.
It's just, there's all this pressure, and sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there.
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing.
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail.
See, you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like, there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. If you would just
Don't.
try to say
Okay, so that was my funny about the nail. Okay. Okay, so when it comes to social support and illness, we know that people who have those connections have less illness. We know that people who have those connections recover faster than people who do not have those connections. Years ago, my father had a cycling injury and a head injury, and he was in a neuro unit for about a month. And one of the things that would happen is he would be unconscious, and then he never went into a coma, but he'd be unconscious, and then he'd wake up. At times he was intubated when he'd wake up, at times he wasn't intubated. But in my family, me and my family, we were with him around the clock. People even slept in the room. They had a couch or a fold-out bed in the actual intensive care unit. And so family members could sleep in there. But anytime my father woke up, somebody was there. Either I was there, my sister was there, my mom was there. And I know, and he didn't know what happened to him. So like, he would wake up and he couldn't remember that he had been in an accident. We'd have to explain to it over and over again until he realized that he had been in an accident and he was in a hospital bed and he was healing. But I know that every time he woke up seeing a family member there who was caring for him and letting him know what had happened, I know that had to have been beneficial for him, as opposed to, say, waking up alone in a hospital room and not knowing what had happened to you and not knowing anybody around you, whether they're nurses or doctors, but just not able to remember them. How scary that would be. We know that social support reduces risk of death, like we saw some data a little bit earlier. And then there's even research, remember the Cohen research, we talked about him, where he would deliver either placebo saline or saline that had the cold virus into people's sinuses, and then do all kinds of different studies on measuring whether or not they got a cold. That the more social networks we have, actually the less colds we get. And again, this is pre-coronavirus type of stuff, but you would think the more social contacts you would have, the more you would be exposed to a cold virus and the more cold you would have. But what this is actually speaking to is that the benefit of the social support on the immune system is very powerful, and having a strong immune system keeps us healthy. All right, the Longevity Project. We can go ahead and watch this.
The Longevity Project actually started in 1921 when Lewis Terman at Stanford recruited over 1,500 kids, boys and girls, to be part of this study. He planned to follow them into early adulthood to see if they grew up to be well-adjusted, thriving people. He actually ended up studying them until he died.
And we picked up the study about 20 years ago and have been trying to see who lives long and who dies young, why some people stay healthy, and why some people become ill.
We published a lot of papers, and people always ask us questions about other studies. We'll start talking about one, and they say, well, what about this? What about that? And we decided that this was a really good time to put together all of the findings in one spot, in one book, so that people who are interested generally about all the different things that lead to long life and health could find them in one place. There's a huge myth that's out there, which is that if you want to live a long life, you need a long checklist of do's and don'ts. All the right foods to eat, all the foods that you should never eat, all of the exercises that you need to do, even if you hate them. And the Longevity Project is really a myth buster. What we discovered is that you don't need a long checklist in order to live a long life. It's really a lot simpler than that.
There were many surprising and intriguing findings in the Longevity Project. One of those that amazed me the most was that hard work, and even stressful hard work, was not harmful. Actually, the people who work the hardest live the longest.
What we found, and this is true in other shorter term studies as well, is that cheerfulness and optimism really is a good thing, particularly if you're facing a short term crisis. You know, it sort of keeps you motivated. If you expect that things will turn out okay, you may be more likely to hang in there with a treatment or some sort of a process that will get you back on your feet. But as a life approach, the children who were more cheerful and optimistic and kind of happy-go-lucky, they tended to take a lot more risks with their health. They had an attitude that was sort of, everything will turn out all right. And that tended to make them a bit more careless, which wasn't good in terms of their longevity. Probably the most surprising thing to me in the longevity project was the differences that we found for men versus women when they encountered divorce. Divorce certainly is stressful and a bad thing for anyone, but men were really able to improve their odds and ameliorate their risk by getting remarried after a divorce. That wasn't really so much the case for women. Women were just about as well off if they stayed single following a divorce.
Of course, exercise in the form of physical activity is predictive of long life. It does help keep you healthy, but not the kind of exercise that most people usually worry about and obsess about. It wasn't necessary to go to the gym the same time every day and do the same certain number of activities, keep track of how many steps you've taken each day. The people who lived the longest, they didn't worry about things like that. They just lived a naturally active life, and that was sufficient. Many of the parents in this study were smart parents, and they had smart children in the study, and they thought, well, let's give them an advantage by putting them in school really early. But we found that starting first grade, structured environment, too early an age, was really harmful. It led to problems in adolescence for the children. It led to problems later in life, and in fact, they died at a younger age. The Longevity Project doesn't burden you with endless lists of things to do to lead a long and healthy life. In fact, it shows that certain simple, straightforward patterns can be developed that anybody can develop. And once you get on the right pattern, you are much more likely to live a long and healthy life.
If my screen share did not work for you all, if you couldn't see these clips I've showed you, I'm going to end this part one of the social support lecture right now. I'd like for you just to go back and click those yourself, if you can see these on the PowerPoint. Load it into your browser and watch it. I do want to point out in the Longevity Project that they found that emotional connections and social ties were critical to people's health, that these term children, these really high IQ term children, that they tracked into later life and eventually tracked them until they got sick and they died, that those who were isolated had more health problems and died sooner than those who had the close connections. What they also found was that the personality construct of conscientiousness, which we had known before then was really valuable for people getting their education. Conscientious students usually learn better and get better grades. Employees who are conscientious usually do better in the workforce than employees that are not conscientious. But they found in Longevity Project that conscientiousness was also a valuable personality trait in terms of relationships. So as an example, imagine that I'm in my office in the workforce, and I remember that my secretary's puppy was sick last week. That if I go in and visit the secretary, maybe because I need her to do some work for me, but then I say, hey, how's your puppy doing? Remembering that, being conscientious about that is going to feel really valuable for that person who is the owner of that puppy, as an example. Okay, I'm going to call this and stop share. So this is the end of part one of social support, and be looking when you're ready for the link for part two.